All right, Shabbat Shalom, friends. We are so honored to have Dr. Ken Stein here from Atlanta. And if you haven't yet heard him either last night or this morning, he is the preeminent expert on Arab-Israeli negotiations, on the history of an establishment of Israel. And you can read his bio longer, but it's already a little late in the morning, so I want to have the opportunity for us to get as much time as we can with Dr. Stein, who is here, and grateful that he and Lynn were able to travel here from Atlanta. Without further ado, Dr. Ken Stein.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you all for coming back after lunch. It's in the second quarter of Penn State 3, Ohio State 3. And the most important score is Long Island 20, Mamaroneck 0. I guess, I don't know. So this is, as I said during services, it's a crazy weekend to be addressing Arab-Israeli issues, but nonetheless, learning matters. What Joshua Jacobs asked me to do this afternoon is talk a little bit, make some remarks about why negotiations work and why they don't. And I think what's happened in the last 2 weeks is, I've got some pretty good examples to draw upon for reference. After teaching for 44 years at Emory, my family, my 3 boys, 3 daughters-in-law, 6 grandkids all said, you know, Pops, it's time for you to stop writing letters of recommendation and attending history department meetings. It wasn't a tough sell. Letters of recommendation are really difficult because you have to write detail for each young person, and sometimes it makes or breaks a kid's ability to get into school. Department administration is not something I ever loved. I knew that in 1983, actually 86. I knew it in 1986 after I'd been the first executive director of the Carter Center. And Carter, when he left the White House and lost to Ronald Reagan in end of 1980, he was casting about to do something, and so he stayed in Atlanta, Georgia, and he became a university professor, and he wanted to create a center for the study of conflict resolution. And I got thrown onto a committee, and we outlined what an action-oriented center would look like. So Carter would have a podium, a platform to stand on in order to talk about issues that mattered to him. He wasn't interested in talking about the budget or financial stuff or taxes or education reform. He wanted to talk about international affairs. He was still wedded deeply to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and he wanted to resolve it. And he felt he could have had he been reelected. And I spent the next decade running around with him in a positive way in the Middle East. I was his political affairs advisor. I was a speechwriter. I spent a lot of time trying to tone down his op-eds that were sometimes blistering against the state of Israel. But I learned from Zionist history, particularly Weizmann, when he resigned from the presidency of the World Zionist Organization in 1931, I learned that you can't affect change if you're on the outside. You can only affect change or have influence if you're on the inside. I mean, how can you influence someone and what they're writing if you're sitting in a classroom at Emory, but you're not sitting as a Middle East fellow of the Carter Center? But that wasn't the original purpose for joining. The original purpose for joining was he was going to explore Middle East peace, and this was a way for me to get a lot of experience very quickly from someone who had negotiated with Begin Sadat at Camp David and before and after. And he saw my passion for studying the conflict, teaching it, and he said, will you join? And I said, sure. And the question I asked him when I joined was, in 82, I believe it was, I said, so what is your resolution to the conflict? I said, tell me what you want to see as the end point. Now, then remember, this is 82. And he said, I'd like to see a two-state solution. I said, I would too. And I'd like to see, if not a two-state solution, I'd like to see at least the two sides separate from each other, because I know from history, because I studied the mandate, I studied the origins of modern Israel. I sat in the Central Zionist Archives, I sat in the Israel State Archives, and I learned a heck of a lot about how the Zionists built the state. I mean, I studied the Karen Kayemet documents. I learned how they bought acre upon acre, and they connected immigrants to the land, and I learned about how the British interacted, and I learned about the violence from 36 to 39. I understood that the only way these two populations could exist on the same turf if they lived apart from each other. Now, however you arranged the term apart, was it an arrangement? Was it two states? Was it, one state would have autonomy, the other one would have sovereignty? It didn't bother me. What I was concerned about is, like this aisle here, that one side had to be here and the other side had, and they didn't need to be in each other's business. If they wanted to be in each other's business, it had because one side was in the other's business so that they could both benefit. So working with Carter, I learned from a lot of people who worked with him in the White House, in the State Department, how diplomacy works. Now, I was a historian trained at the University of Michigan, where I studied Middle Eastern history, Jewish history, political science. By the way, one of my professors at the University of Michigan, a young assistant professor, a young guy by the name of Reinhardt. Yeah, believe it or not, Yehuda, thank heavens, taught me a lot about Zionist history. I mean, I had some really good people at Michigan. And I learned the history. Now I was going to be thrown into learning about the diplomacy. I was going to learn about how people interact. I was going to learn about Sadat. I was going to learn about the 73 war. I didn't know. I knew a lot already, but I didn't know all the detail. I didn't have all of the nuances. Hadn't interviewed 84 people. I went around for the next 15 years. I interviewed 84 people and wrote a book on the peace process in the 70s, Heroic Diplomacy. It was published in 98. I can assure you, it's an interesting read. It probably is as good as anything that's ever been written on the 70s. The amount of revenue I get as reward is less than $100 a year. So even if you run out and buy it, don't worry about it. I think I get 10 cents a copy if it's sold. There's some great vignettes in it. That's why I would recommend it, Heroic Diplomacy. Joshua said, why don't you talk about why negotiations work? Because you studied it, and now compare it to why they won't work now. And I thought, good idea, and I'll use the information I personally gathered from interviewing lots of people and reading a lot, but it also has much of it has to do with people expressing to me what they saw at a particular moment, at a particular time when they were involved in it. And when you interview bureaucrats and diplomats, most of them do not have a dog in the hunt. It's a Southern expression. I'm from Long Island, Southern Long Island. That's as close as I get to the South or Atlanta, Georgia. But most of them have crystal clear memories, and it's fascinating to listen to what they have to say, because they will give you every semicolon, who said what to whom and who coughed when and why. And so I then transcribed them. I transcribed the interviews. Then I put some of the interviews now on our website, israeled.org, under transcripts. I think there must be 15 to 20 of the transcripts that I used in writing the book, Heroic Diplomacy. And it's all there for you to read. I mean, you can just dive in and read for 3-4 hours at a time if you want. Some of it is really interesting. Some of it is, a yawner, and go, I think I'll go back and watch the Monday Night Football instead. Arab-Israeli negotiations happened because individual leaders wanted it to happen. That's why the book is called Heroic Diplomacy, because Sadat was a hero, and Begin was a hero. Carter was a mediator. And without Anwar Sadat, there would never have been a negotiating process, a diplomatic process, that ultimately led to a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979. He knew he wanted to take his country to a different place. It had been dependent upon the Soviet Union. They had expended a lot of men and material and treasure in fighting the '67 war, and they lost Sinai. And Sadat wanted to reverse that. He wanted to change Egypt's direction. He didn't negotiate with Israel because he wanted to be a Zionist. He didn't negotiate with Israel because he wanted to, but because he needed to. It was a remark I made last night. He needed to, in order to get Egypt out of this malaise, out of this swamp of spending so much money on a conflict that wasn't a benefit to the Egyptian people. His predecessor had been committed to liberating Sinai and destroying Israel. That was his modus operandi. That was his ideology of pan-Arabism. That's how Nasser ran Egypt in the 50s and 60s. And Nasser brought in all the young kids who were then in high school, and they imbibed Nasser's pan-Arabism of destroying the state of Israel, including young mosque leaders who were Palestinians by birth and ultimately would find their way back to Gaza. You begin to see the dots I'm trying to connect. Sadat went to war in 73, and he only had a limited military objective, and that was to go across the canal, take some land, and stop. The Israelis were caught by surprise. They were arrogant that Arab states couldn't effectively attack them, and they would be, they'd lose lots of men. So halfway through the war, Kissinger is contacted by Sadat, and Sadat says, I want to engage in diplomacy. I want you to help me end the war and begin negotiations with the Israelis. And Golda was furious. Why would you attack us if you wanted to go to war? And Sadat's answer was, I asked you before the war if you wanted to negotiate, and you said you didn't because you weren't satisfied with a non-belligerency agreement. And she said, yeah, that's right. I wanted a full peace if we're going to do any kind of negotiations. Was the '73 war avoidable? I don't know. It's an argument that historians are making, but what-ifs are just that. They're what-ifs. You can't reach particular conclusions because you don't know for certain. When Sadat entered into negotiation with Kissinger and Golda after the '73 war, they went to a peace conference where Kissinger choreographed it in such a way that you'd come out of the peace conference and the Egyptians and the Israelis would sign a disengagement agreement in which their troops would separate, but Kissinger had it on the books before they even went to the conference. I mean, it was pre-cooked. And that's what Sadat wanted. He only wanted to know what the conclusion was before he went to negotiations. And he didn't want another Arab state to control his decision. So for the next next 4 years, he and Israel negotiate a couple of agreements. Carter comes to power, comes to office, and Carter says another agreement between Egypt and Israel is not necessary. They don't have a treaty yet. Carter says, I want to solve the whole thing all at once. Now, Syrian nationalism, Jordanian nationalism, Palestinian Arab nationalism, Libyan nationalism, Saudi nationalism, they did not want to recognize the state of Israel in 1977. But Carter said, I don't care. I'm going to force them back into the toothpaste tube. I'm going to make them go back into where I want. I want a comprehensive peace achieved in a comprehensive way, all questions being asked and answered in an international conference, as if somehow the Hatfield and McCoys were going to lay down together and stop arguing about who's going to produce moonshine. Carter kept on pushing and pushing until Sadat said, whoa, you're going to let the Syrians negotiate for me? You're going to let the PO negotiate for me? I want my land back. And so what does he do? He announces to the Egyptian parliament in November of 1977, I'm going to go to their house, and he does. 9 days later, he speaks in the Knesset with a picture of Theodore Herzl behind him. He said, look, you get out of the territories, we'll give you peace. But you got to get out of all of them. And Begin said, wait. Judea and Samaria is mine, ours. He wore Sadat down until Sadat finally said, okay, I'm not going to concern myself too much about the Palestinians. I'm going to worry about getting back Sinai, and the United States is going to give me a great economic arrangement. They're going to provide us with military supply, and we'll get a treaty. Now, the treaty was a transaction. Egypt agrees to do this, Israel agrees to do that. There'll be so and so many troops in the Sinai, and there'll be a demilitarized zone here and a demilitarized zone there, and you can have so and so many tanks and so many armored personnel carriers, and there'll be X number of people who will be in between you, and you have to withdraw from all the settlements. And so by the end of the 80s, all the settlements are withdrawn, and Egypt and Israel have a peace treaty, and Egypt did what Nasser would never have done. By the way, if Nasser hadn't gone to war in 1967 and lost Sinai, Sadat wouldn't have needed it back. Right? I mean, Sadat went to war to restore Egyptian land, and he knew he couldn't get all of it in war with the Israelis because he knew the United States wouldn't let Israel go down the tubes. So he said, I'll use the United States. He was very clever, very smart. And I've interviewed 4 or 5 people who worked for him who said this guy was always 5 or 6 steps ahead of everyone. Henry Kissinger, in one of his last books, he remarks about the 6 most significant international leaders in the world that he ever met, and he put Sadat at the top of the list. Not Brezhnev and not Kosygin and not Chou En-lai, or none of them. Sadat. Because Sadat knew what he wanted for his people. He knew the strategy, but he also knew the tactics and how to get to the strategy, how to affect the strategy. All good leaders know what comes the day after tomorrow. Now, you have to be able to wiggle and go around and get around that speed bump and that pothole in order to get there, but you never lose sight of the prize. And Sadat did it in negotiating with the Israelis when he wasn't attacking them. He wasn't shooting at them. He wasn't throwing bombs at them. Terrorists were not coming from Cairo and landing in Tel Aviv or in Gaza and shooting up Israelis. So a prerequisite for negotiations to exist between Israel and the Palestinians is you need to have leaders who can look over the horizon, and you need to have a measure of trust between the sides, and you can't be shooting at one another while you're trying to negotiate. That's why negotiations today, or even 2 years ago, wasn't going to work because they were nasty to one another. Forget who was more nasty. Forget it whether it was the settlements or it was a bomb that went off in a bus. Forget it. You know, don't, at this particular point as a historian, don't bother me with the details. It's the big concept that matters. So you need leaders who can see over the horizon. And you need to be able to have the sides negotiated between them. One of the most famous American ambassadors to Israel was a guy by the name of Sam Lewis. And Lewis was ambassador from, 77 to 85. I got to know Sam reasonably well, and he was at a conference in Miami in January of, I think, 2011, and he said something to the effect, the mediator can't want an agreement more than the respective sides. That makes sense. So I don't care whether the European Union or the Arab League or the President of the United States, you can't force it on them if they don't want it. Because they live there and you don't. Now, as far as I know, those three criteria, those three variables are not yet there for Palestinians and Israelis to embrace themselves. I don't care how much you want a two-state solution. You can't impose it from Beechwood or Columbus or Ann Arbor. You can't do that. You can scream bloody murder, I want a two-state solution, I want a two-state solution. Until you have a two-state solution, it's not going to be resolved. That's fine and dandy, but tell me how it's going to happen if they don't want it yet. There's a difference between people who write op-ed pieces and people who actually have to negotiate it. So what does Tom Friedman say a couple of days ago? He said, if the Israelis go into Gaza and they wipe Hamas out, it has to be on the condition that there's going to be a two-state solution after. Thank you, Thomas. Very good from writing at 42nd Street in New York City. And I know a lot of people read you, and I know you've written a lot of books, and I know every time you read, you write something, and Biden calls you into the office, or Mohammed bin Salman calls you to Riyadh, and he dictates an article to you, and then you get yourself, you become the editorial diplomat of the 21st century. Wonderful, lovely. I'll embrace Tom. Fine, but it's a piece of paper. And all it does is reinforce people's attitudes that somehow this can be done. There's no doubt that both sides are going to have incentives to do it. You got to put some carrots out there so the respective sides will do it. Doesn't look like Hamas want any carrots. They just want to kill Jews. There's no carrot for them. Their view of a resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict is no Israel. Let's stop pussyfooting around. Let's stop, let's go under the table and not acknowledge the fact that that's what they really want. Just say what they really want. And if that's not going to get you a two-state solution, then say so. You can write as many editorials as you want, but if you don't say Hamas's goal is the destruction of a Jewish state, why are you writing an op-ed piece? Because you have people who are in the progressive or the left of center position who want to embrace what you say. But realistically, it's not going to work at West 65th Street and 7th Avenue. Tachlis is tachlis. And we, as Jews, have got to start speaking up and speaking out about what is real and what it is we want in our heart. Because if we keep embracing what's in our heart, we're not going to be here the day after tomorrow. Because we're going to think that a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict is somehow going to make it easier for Jews to live in a state in the Middle East. We learned 2 weeks ago today that they have no intention whatsoever of living with Israel, Israelis, or Jews. So say it. And don't be afraid to say it. And don't be afraid to teach it to your children. You're not teaching hate. You're teaching realism. FDR on December 7th, 1941, he didn't say, oh, by the way, we're going to go negotiate with the Japanese because they just killed X number of Americans in Pearl Harbor. You know, FDR did not say, here's my other cheek. Did he? Now, why is it that American Jews or Jews throughout the world or Jews are so intent on wanting this agreement between Israel and the people who also want to fight over the same territory? It's because we just want to be loved, accepted. Don't hate us anymore. Because if you create a state for the Palestinians, maybe they won't hate us. Maybe. Just maybe. Now, people are going to walk out of this room today and go, I can't give up my idea of a two-state solution. No matter what Stein says, I can't give it up. Fine. But at least while you're here, you're going to have to come to the conclusion that there are realities that you cannot ignore. The reason that Sadat and Begin embraced each other is they had a common external threat. That was the Soviet Union. There's no common external threat that's facing Israel and the Palestinians. In fact, one element of the Palestinians is embraced, loved, hugged, financed, trained, and provided logistics by the country in the Middle East that wants to see Israel go away yesterday. We are so far away from a negotiated settlement. So far away. Would I like to wake up tomorrow morning and find out there's a Palestinian de Gaulle? You bet. Nixon went to China. I'd love to see a Palestinian say, hey, I'm coming to Jerusalem. Get out of the territories. 2 states, 2 people, demilitarized zone for 15 years. Let's get this thing going. Forget about Hamas. We're going to do this between us and the West Bank. You know, if I read it tomorrow morning in the paper, I'd want to know who was the newspaper writer, what he was doing when he wrote it, and what was he smoking. And lastly, as a criteria for negotiations, both parties have got to believe that there's a brighter future for them respectfully tomorrow. That if they do this, they'll get that tomorrow. That's not there either. So I'm highly pessimistic about a resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, particularly after, and we don't even know what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks, next month and a half, how many Israelis are going to die, how many Palestinians are going to die, how many, we have no clue. You're going to want to ask me, so what do you think is going to happen? Where is it going to go? I don't know. B'nai Jeshurun did not give me a Ouija board. I can only speak from what history teaches me. And history teaches me that you have to go through stages to reach a negotiated settlement. Here are the stages. You have to go from abhorrence to fighting a war, to truce, to building trust, negotiations, recognition, normalization, acceptance, and peace. We are at the enmity abhorrence stage. And I'm not talking about other Arabs in Arab capitals who are in the street protesting with vehemence and vigor on behalf of the Palestinians. That's not even on the table, and it's going to have to be at some point, because external populations who support the respective sides are going to have to be persuaded that an agreement between the sides is worthy. And let me conclude my remarks with this. 1979 was a critical moment in Middle Eastern history. Last night I spoke about benchmarks and turning points. 1979 was a benchmark and turning point. Turning points in history are when an event or events occur and a 90-degree turn happens. 1776. Maybe 9/11. The shooting of Archduke Ferdinand in August of 14. For Jews, 39 to 45. 1979 was an inflection point in Middle Eastern history where three events happened collectively that made it a benchmark. It made it a benchmark and a turning point because events that flowed from 79 are still nibbling with us in the Middle East. The Egyptian-Israeli treaty, an Arab state embraces the state of Israel, and those people who oppose it say, we can't tolerate this, and we're going to have to find a way to undo it. And those are some of the mosque leaders who are now in Gaza. Their opposition to the Egyptian-Israeli treaty was very significant. They championed it because they didn't want an Arab state recognizing a Jewish state. And they made it part of their charter. Part of the Hamas charter is to reject any negotiation that Israel has with any Arab state because it's null and void, because no one has the right to recognize the Jewish state and Jews in control of the land, any of the land west of the Jordan River. Egyptian-Israeli treaty. Now, it may have bought Israel 45 years of non-war with Egypt and may have brought a measure of tranquility to Egypt itself, but it spawned an attitude that said, oh no, we're going to find a way to undo this. The second event of 79. Six presidents had embraced the Shah of Iran. And he lost control of his country. For whatever reason. He was a spendthrift. He didn't pay attention to the lower classes. He was buying too many weapons from the United States. He was living high off the hog with oil money, whatever you want to call it. But the other side of the Shah's fall was the rise of the Khomeini regime and the rise of fundamentalist Islam as a political platform to undo or to influence politics in the Middle East. The rise of political Islam was from 79 forward. Islam played a very important role in people's identity in the Middle East, but all of a sudden it became politically active and a credible way to undo secular leaders. And the Shah was a secular leader. He wasn't Arab, he was a Muslim leader. He was an Iranian leader. But the fall of the Shah and the rise of Khomeiniism is a gift that keeps on giving to the Middle East. Hamas receives financial assistance, logistical aid, training, indoctrination, whatever you want to call it. And that's 79, that's 20 years, that's 44 years, 43 years. And we know they have an influence in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. And we know there are 2 or 3 other toxic foreign insurgencies that they support. And then the third event was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, in which people stood around and watched the Soviets overtake Afghanistan, and then the local militias wanted to throw out the Soviets, and they took arms, and they realized they could take up arms against any state because the states in the Middle East were weak. So they began to clash against the secular Arab or the secular leaders that had come to power after World War II. And the Arab Spring was in 2010 and 2011 was an effort on the part of people in the street that's saying we're fed up with all of these governments, and then the governments stomped on them. And the autocrats just continued. I'm saying this intentionally. The person who was president of the United States in 1979, the 39th president of the United States, was Jimmy Carter. He was the first governor to become president since Harry Truman. He had absolutely no foreign policy experience. He didn't know what political cultures were. He thought Sadat could represent all the Arabs, and he couldn't. He and Brzezinski were paying more attention to Egyptian-Israeli treaties and negotiations than they were to the possibility of slowing down the revolt in Iran. Did he lose Iran? I don't know if Carter lost Iran. But his lack of knowledge certainly added to it. And when I asked him in the early 80s on several occasions, do you think you lost Iran? He said, that's not the question. I said, what's the question? He said, well, we couldn't support the Shah. I said, did you have any understanding of what was going on in Paris with Ayatollah Khomeini and fundamentalist Islam as a means to overthrow secular nationalism? No, Ken, I don't think I recall us ever having concerned us. I know our information from the CIA was not what we thought it should be. And I said, well, is that because you cut back on CIA intelligence gathering? He said, well, I don't know, but maybe. Sir, what did you just do with your hand? Right? Were you at my session earlier this morning? And I said Ben Gurion and Begin and with their head in their hand? You can't put people in positions of influence and power if they don't know what they're doing. Oh, thank you, Ken. We can't even get a Speaker of the House. Before we throw stones at other people in other houses, we all throw stones at our own. I hope when you go to vote, and I hope you go frequently, like Mayor Daley would say, I hope you'll choose people who are adults and not people who are ideologues. We can't afford to have inexperienced people running our affairs of government. I want to read you one quote, and then I'm going to finish. Here we go. Right there. I don't have it, but suffice it to say that if someone says in 2015 that Hamas should be accepted as a legitimate political actor for the Palestinians because they represent a viable Palestinian interest. And the international community should not demand that they drop terrorism before they get accepted as a political actor. What do you think about a person who says that? Crazy? Crazy. So I traced this person's remarks about Hamas going back to 2003. And I've now come up with 4.5 pages of about 20 quotations. You know who said it? And said it, something like it, about 15 times? Jimmy Carter. Now, who holds a former president accountable? And one of the Hamas leaders said, "Thank you, Mr. President, for coming. I want you to know that you were very helpful and instrumental in helping people in the international community provide us with legitimacy. Thank you, sir." I learned a lot working for Carter. I'm indebted to him because I really learned the equivalent of another PhD. But that doesn't mean everything he said and everything he did is something he does I embrace. So after 2 weeks ago, I went and I started looking through my trusty computer to find out what Carter said and when he said it. Sometime in the next 10 days, it'll be up on our website, and I can assure you it's going to explode across the internet. What did Condoleezza Rice say to him in 2005 or 2006? "Don't go visit Hamas, you're only going to give them the legitimacy." And he said, "I don't think I'm going to give them legitimacy, I think they're a legitimate actor." Really? We have to have standards. We have to have limitations on what people can do and say. We have to elect people or appoint people who are smart. We have to have criteria of excellence. We cannot continue to just kick the can down the road. September 2013, standing in front of the UN, the man said, "I want the Iranians to come to an agreement with us on their future nuclear program, comma, I want the Iranians to know that we're not interested in regime change." Why? In blankety blank name would you say that in public that you're not interested in regime change? Because you want to play nice? Barack Obama. I don't have a favorite when it comes to indicting leaders. I don't. I don't have Democrats, I don't have Republicans. I have people who are stupid or unaware of what they're doing. And we have to hold all our government officials and former government officials accountable. What happened 2 weeks ago is, as I said last night, these 2 weeks have been the worst 2 weeks in my Jewish life in 77 years. And it's not going to get better. I walk around with a 24/7 pit in my stomach. I didn't want to say it today from the Bima during the service. But if anyone had any doubt about the bar mitzvah families, relatives who survived the Holocaust and what they went through, and the fear and the anxiety and the evil they faced, that's what happened in Israel 2 weeks ago. But I wasn't going to do that in the middle of a bar mitzvah. It was inappropriate. I can do it now. Learn, listen, ask great questions, force your leaders to answer them. Don't let them get away with pablum. Make them accountable, make them accountable. And when in doubt, make them accountable. Rabbi Hal and Josh, I think we ought to give everyone an individual bottle of scotch to have suffered through this presentation. Thank you very much. Right, but you're going to have to take your, I can't hear over that, so you're going to have to, when you get finished, will you give it to this gentleman?
Sure.
Go ahead.
I recently learned at my place of employment that there's a religious, I don't know if it's a minhag or a religious thing, that a non-Muslim cannot touch a Muslim. It makes me ask the question whether there's some religious aspect to an opinion that a non-Muslim cannot be on land. I know that they have feelings about the Temple Mount. Whether there is a religious Muslim edict, essentially, that goes back centuries, that non-Muslims should not be in what we consider the land of Israel.
Great question. So the answer, the question is embedded in Islamic philosophy or the time of Muhammad. Jews were to be a tolerated minority. They weren't supposed to be fully accepted into the community. And there are surahs or chapters in the Quran that speak about don't trust a Jew, they may be involved in treachery. There are some nasty things said in the Quran, and books can or cannot be adhered to, read, followed. But if you want someone to understand or you want someone to imbibe, you'll give them what it is you want them to imbibe. And if you want them to imbibe a hatred for Jews, you can find it in Islamic law or Islamic code or Islamic tradition. Now, I'm not saying every Muslim in the world believes in it. It also says, Rabbi Hal, forgive me, there's a chapter in Numbers. There's a book in Numbers called Masai, M-A-S-S-E-I, right? Something like that. One of the last two or something like that, right? And I think in it, it says to Moses, when you go across the Jordan, you're supposed to expel the people from the land, because if you don't, you'll go against my commitment or my promise to you, and it will come back to haunt you. That's not exactly how he says it. That's not exactly what's written. But if you can find that quotation, a Muslim or an Arab could say, you see, you guys were taught to drive us out. This is what you want. You want to drive us out. Look, it says it in your book. You can play this game till, back and forth, right? Right? It depends how serious you take that particular passage or passages. It's a good question because it forces the individual to decide what is most relevant to them as guides for their behavior in life and what they should think about the other. Sir.
How closely aligned is the Palestinian Authority vis-a-vis Hamas? Are their goals the same? Are they just giving lip service to whatever?
Good. It's another great question for distinction purposes. Palestinian Authority accepts the legitimacy of Israel because it recognizes that the agreements that it has with Israel is giving it the right to have self-governance on the West Bank, or a portion of the West Bank, most of the West Bank, some of it. And Hamas argues fully against the PA and the PLO in their recognition of the State of Israel. Because it legitimized the Jewish state in the eyes of the international community, and therefore they have to be undone. The PA and the PLO have got to be undone. Hamas is willing to reach interim agreements with the Jews as long as it's known this is not a final arrangement between Israel and the Jews, because ultimately we can gain portions of the territory in phases, but ultimately we have to gain it all back. And the PA says that's not exactly our point of view, but right now the PA is very, very weak, enormously weak. And it's surviving on the international community and from NGOs and sometimes from the goodwill of the Israelis. And I'm not saying the Israelis, what they do in the territories is something, I want to see happen tomorrow morning with my grandchildren. But there's a distinction between the two. Now, I don't know how long the distinction is going to last. I don't know, Jordan and Egypt would want to see the PA strengthened. But they can't now go against public opinion that's running rampant through the streets of Arab capitals that are supporting Hamas for denting the Israelis. None of the Arab media in the first 2 or 3 days, to my knowledge, Arab press that I've read, and it's only about 6 or 7 newspapers, editorials, has praised Hamas but said what you did was too much. In other words, the nuance and the distinction of if you want to hurt Israel, go ahead and hurt Israel, but don't butcher people. That distinction has not appeared yet. I doubt it will. It's all right. We got time for one more? Your choice, my friend. You go. Here. All right, you, and then give it to that gentleman.
Okay. So one thing that's been said recently is that up till now, Israel mows the grass every few years to maintain some kind of at least not war, if not peace. And now we could... So, all right, the idea... Yeah, okay. The idea is Israel can no longer afford maybe to just mow the grass or take out a few weeds. But if that means some kind of forceful ground war, which may or may not have already started, maybe the most frightening thing is how does that even turn out? And I wonder whether you think that is where this is headed, that you can no longer mow the grass.
There is a major political concept that has been created in the last 2 weeks that also existed beforehand, which is called the head of the snake. That yes.
So what's the question?
So they talk about, many political analysts in Israel and in this country, that unfortunately, in spite of this major calamity that has fallen on the Jewish nation and Israel especially, with all these casualties and all these dead people and hostages, in spite of that...
No. Just give me the question, not the preference.
Okay, the question is, what do you think Israel and the Jewish nation think about the concept of the head of the snake?
I mean, the Israelis have already said, sir. Yes. The Israelis have already said, the Israeli government has already said that they need to wipe out Hamas. They need to deny its ability to be a military organization that can effectively operate. they've stated their goals. You know, the defense minister has stated it. The prime minister has stated it. They've stated we have to get rid of this entity that's a thorn in our side. It's that simple. The Israelis haven't hidden what their goal is. They've been quite blunt about what their goal is. They've been quite blunt about it. Even the President of the United States has been blunt about it. Listen to what they say. We have to get rid of Hamas as a fighting force that is threatening our very well-being. It's not a question of should they. It's a question of how will they do it and what's the cost going to be. That's the issue. So I'm going to ask you to, if you will, go to the website, go to israeled.org, ISRAELED, israeled.org. We have materials there to read about Hamas. It's all for free. Materials about the war, the materials about Israel's history. Just go learn, dive into it. Chocolate ice cream, chocolate sauce with Raisinets. Shabbat shalom.
I want to thank Dr. Stein. Bernard will give you a chance for a one-on-one. Tomorrow morning is Dr. Stein's last class at 9:30. It's going to be interactive. He's going to take us through his website so that you can see what we can each see, and in particular focusing on the current war in Hamas, but also going back and from his history and his approach to history and understanding of history. So we'll hope you join us. It will also be on Zoom, God willing, if technology works. So breakfast at 9 and session 9:30. Thank you, Dr. Stein.